Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 13, on the 6th of November 1945, a baby boy is born in a small village outside Nadi in Fiji. One of 6 children, people noted that as a young boy he had an adventurous spirit. As a young man, this adventurous spirit would take him thousands of miles on a journey that hundreds of others will follow. But this isn't just a story about another rugby league player. This is a story about a man who took incredible risks on behalf of his family and his people. This is the story of the first Fijian. This is the story of Apisai Toga. To help tell us this story, we're going to speak to former St George player and Apisai's nephew, Colin Sakuru. Colin, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
Thanks very much.
Colin, Apisai was born in the village of Saunaka. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, that's correct.
What was life like for Apisai growing up in Saunaka in the 90s and 40s and 50s? What was life would have been like for him?
Well, at that time, in particularly in Fiji, a lot of people were still living on their rural properties. They grew up on farms, which most families had mainly crops. They'd grow crops.
Okay.
Sort of and sugar cane, particularly in the west there in Nadi and parts of the west of Fiji. Sugar cane was a big crop. And farmed animals, just certain cows and stuff like that. So a lot of the families, a lot of the kids that grew up in the villages and on farms.
And there was schooling. Schooling was available.
Yes.
Yeah.
Each village had schooling available, and the higher sort of schools were in the sort of town centres. So, but each individual village had their own little school set up.
And as a boy, Apisai, did he show some interest in sports, or did he have a bit of an athletic ability as a young kid?
Yes. Like most of Fiji, most of the kids in the village and they all grow up just playing and learning rugby union. So they find anything to play with too. They don't necessarily have a football. They use bottles and stuff like that. So it's a big thing in the village. Yeah, kids love it.
Okay, Colin. Now that's important because in 1963, the first ever South Pacific Games are staged in Fiji. This is a sort of an Olympic Games type event, and Apisai is selected to represent Fiji in the rugby union event at this contest. How did they go there? How did Fiji go in this first ever South Pacific Games?
I think they went pretty well. Those in particular amongst the Pacific, they were one of the stronger teams.
Yes.
Internationally, so they went pretty good against some of those other smaller nations.
Well,
who were building at the time, but the game had been in Fiji for a while before then, so they were always ranked higher than the other nations.
Yes, yeah. Well, in fact, they did actually win the gold medal there, and apparently Apisai was sort of like one of the standout players in this tournament. So Fiji did win the gold medal in the rugby union event at those games. Now, Colin, yes. The next big event in Apisai's life comes in 1964 when he signs to play for Rochdale Hornets, Rugby League for Rochdale Hornets in England. So how did this come about, mate? How did he end up playing for Rochdale Hornets in England?
Look, I think a lot of those clubs in Northern England went on sort of recruiting recruitment, and they targeted some of the island places, particularly Fiji. Now, Fiji has got a long relationship with England itself, because a lot of young men of Fiji at the time, and even to this day, they when they finish school and they wish to join the military, they sort of apply for the British Army, and there's quite a lot of Fijians in the British Army, and so the relationship between the two nations was pretty strong, and still is. Now they got recruited. Yeah, there was a few guys, in particular Apisai, that were playing for the national team, and were offered to go by these clubs in Northern England to relocate over there and play for them.
So
particularly from his province, yeah.
So Apisai wasn't the first. There were already Fijians playing for Rochdale Hornets when he. Yes. There was like a. Well, I can count off the top of my head. There's probably at least 4 guys that were there before Apisai. All right, but when he left, I read something about. Well, there was sort of I don't know. I suppose you'd call it a cultural taboo about Fijians leaving Fiji. You know, the chiefs sort of decided that if you're Fijian, you're always Fijian. You should always be in Fiji. Was this sort of a difficult move for him to make? To sort of, well, I imagine it was a difficult move, but those sort of cultural aspects as well. Did that sort of play on his mind? Do you think?
I think so. Yeah. It is. Yeah. You particularly when you with those your relationship and that with in the village and
yes,
and everything like that. It's quite close knit, tight knit. So to leave, you've got to do your you've got to do like a presentation and things like that to the local chief in your village to say that your intentions are leaving the village and you're doing where you're going or what you're going to do, and he accepts it and it's all good. But I imagine it was pretty tough leaving Fiji to go in a country that was halfway around the world.
Yes, all right. So, Colin, he makes his debut for Rochdale on February the 15th, 1964. It's a home game against Workington Town. But I'm interested to know, did Apisai enjoy his time at Rochdale? I mean, as you said there, it's a long way from Fiji to the north of England. Did he enjoy his time playing for Rochdale?
I think definitely. I think he did. Like I said, it's quite tough being in another country, but having the support of those other Fijians
yes,
that were there, that would have helped a lot. Being homesick, in terms of homesickness and that, definitely. And those guys, they're from that were there were from neighbouring villages in the province of Nadi too. So
okay,
that helped a lot, definitely.
The weather. Was the weather a problem?
Yes, I think, yeah. But definitely the weather coming from the tropics to living in, at times sub-zero temperatures and snow and that, it would have taken a while to sort of adapt to. But I suppose once they got on the football field, it was they blocked all that out.
Well, he plays 98 matches for Rochdale. I think we should point out, Colin, that Rochdale is not one of the sort of big clubs in England. But in Apisai's time at Rochdale, they do sort of, they're continuing to climb the table. In 1967, the final year that he was there, they actually finished 18th. Now, people might say, well, 18th doesn't sound like a great result, but I think you've got to remember that at this time there were 30 teams in the English First Division. It was it was a big competition, so they finished 18th. The highlight, obviously, of his time at Rochdale came in 1965, obviously, when they made the Lancashire Cup final. The Lancashire Cup final, and that was a big event, obviously played between the teams from Lancashire. Unfortunately, they were beaten by Warrington in that final. But whatever, Apisai obviously left a very big impression with the Rochdale fans because, he was voted into the supporters' all-time best teammate. He was described as, I'll quote here, a great player and a great gentleman, a true rugby league hero, massive in every sense, a genuine international player. So the fans obviously loved Apisai.
Yes. I've heard similar stories too. That they just they loved him in every aspect, like you said. He'd play his game, but particularly off the field, and that he was quite, the quiet type, and he was very well mannered, and they really took to him.
I mean, even to this day, I understand there is still a fairly significant Fijian sort of community in Rochdale, and even when they played the last World Cup that they played in England, which was in 2013, I think it might have been. Yes, it was, yeah. The Fijian team went up to Rochdale and played one of their warm-up games up against Rochdale.
Yeah, I remember that. There's still a Fijian influence. Those players that were there, a few of them ended up that were there in the early 60s. They ended up marrying the local women, and their descendants are still there today. It's a great story.
All right, so Colin, Apisai, his last game for Rochdale there is in March in 1967. It's a home game against Oldham. Then he decides to come to Australia. Now, do you know why? Why did he want to come to Australia? What was the influence? What was driving this decision, mate? What?
Yeah. The big thing that I know was homesickness. He really missed going back to Fiji. To see his family. He wasn't married at the time or anything. So his parents were there, and he just wanted to help out as much as he can while he's playing. To his family back home. That was the main. The main reason why he had agreed to come to Australia to play.
I also read there was a sort of a family friend, a fellow called Bob Godfrey, who worked for Canadian Pacific Airways. Does the family remember anything about Bob Godfrey? Because apparently Bob Godfrey was a person that sort of encouraged Apisai to come to Australia to try out.
Okay.
Well, this is something that I read there that he encouraged Apisai to come over to Sydney and try his luck in Sydney. Now, when he got to Australia, is it true that he was negotiating with South Sydney?
Yes. Now I'll go through what I've been told, and
yes.
Was that he was when one of the Australian touring teams, the Kangaroos, was touring England at the time, and they had a warm up game or sort of midweek match against Huddersfield. Now, Apisai was in that team that played against the Aussies, and played pretty good. And he impressed a few of the players who he played, who was in that Australian team.
Right. Okay.
They were very impressed with his game. In particular, a few of the South Sydney players. So what they did was they contact their officials back in Australia and told them, there's a guy we played against who might be a right fit for our team in Sydney.
Okay.
He'd be great for us. So from then on, it was South Sydney sort of went after him and started negotiating with him, and basically said, look, if you want to come, we'd like you to come to Australia to play in the Sydney competition. They basically said, a good thing about that deal that they really reinforced to him when they were talking to him was he'd be able to go home at the end of each season. Which was massive to him, and they sort of they really ran that point home, saying, look, you come to play for us, we'll pay you this amount and blah blah. But most importantly, at the end of each season, you're only at a 3-hour flight, 3.5-hour flight home to Fiji.
Yes.
Which they really sold it to him, and he was sold on that. So what happened was he agreed with it, with the South Sydney offer. He didn't sign, but he agreed with it.
Yes.
Over the phone. So South Sydney went Tom and said, look, we've he's gone back, by the way. He's went back to Rochdale, and he told them, look, I've been offered to go to play for South Sydney in Australia. They've offered me, they gave me an offer, and I'm going to take it because I'll be closer to going home each year.
Yes.
And Rochdale said, look, they said, look, we understand your situation and that. Leave it with us, and we'll see if we can come back, because we really want you to stay. So they came back with an offer with a bit more than what he was earning at the time, but they threw one of their local pubs on top of it.
Really? Okay.
As a sweetener, yeah, to stay.
So he's going to get a pub if he stayed up in Rochdale.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was thrown on top of the deal that they put to Apisai. But Apisai, look, he said, look, it's a great deal, but I'm going to stick with my decision and leave and go and play in Australia. So that they sort of took that on board.
Yep.
Now, yeah. So he got back in contact with South Sydney, who arranged for his flight and everything to go back to leave and go meet them in Sydney.
Yes,
where
yes.
He'd sign where he put pen to paper, so to speak. So he's flown back, and he's got off at Kingsford Smith Airport. And the South Sydney officials, they hadn't arrived yet to pick him up as he's come out of into the terminal there.
Right. Okay.
But, yeah. So, but not knowing at this time was the other side of it was a few of the St George players that were playing in that team that was touring and played against him.
Yep.
Did the same thing and called their secretary at the time, Frank Facer.
Yes.
And told him that, look, there's a guy here, he'd be all right for us. South Sydney's are looking to sign him, and he's arriving on this date, and blah, blah, this and that. And so he's come out of the terminal at Sydney at Kingsford Smith, and there was no South Sydney official there at the time. They hadn't arrived yet, but Frank Facer was there.
Okay.
And Frank Facer went up and approached him and said, look, are you Apisai Toga? Yeah. He goes, look, I understand you've come to Australia to play with us, South Sydney. And he said, yeah. He said, have you signed anything? He said, no. He said, oh, well, we just said, if you don't mind me asking, how much do they offer? And he said, oh, this amount. And they said I could, pay for my fare to go home every year at the end of each season to Fiji.
Yeah.
And so Facer's just going, look, I'll offer you double that, and I'll still do the same deal I wanted to do where I said we can send you home at the end of each season. And Apisai took it, and left with Frank Facer that day, and South never really got into the picture.
Okay.
So it was.
Yes.
It was a bit of an ambush from St George, but he never got to put the South jersey on or anything. St George had come from nowhere and got their man.
Yeah. Well, they said at the time that he signed for it was in December 1967 that he signed with St George. They said it was at the time it was a record £2,000 that he was being
playing.
The
transfer thing was at the time the biggest in the game.
And Frank Facer, of course, he was the St George secretary, as you said. He was still a bit, I suppose you could say, he was a bit stung by the fact that. Of course, St George had lost the premiership crown in 1967, so it was said that Frank was a bit stung by that, a bit upset by that, and of course, getting back at South Sydney was by signing Apisai was a way of getting back at South Sydney.
I would say that would have played its part definitely in that in that side of things.
Now, Colin. He makes his debut for St George in round 1 in 1968. It's against Eastern Suburbs. And I've got to say that in itself is a pretty good effort because, Colin, as I just said there, St George, the great run of 11 premierships has ended in 1967, but there's still a very strong side, especially in the forwards there, because Johnny Raper is still there. In the second row, you've got guys like Barry Beath, Elton Rasmussen, Keith Madison, the English international Dick Huddard from Whitehaven is still there. Front row,
that's right. It was still the nucleus of a really good team still there.
But so I think it's a pretty good effort that Apisai actually got into the first grade team with that sort of competition. Even in the front row, John Wittenberg and Graham Bowen were there, so it was a pretty good effort. And he makes his first grade debut. Norm Provan, who's the coach of St George at this stage. Norm has retired from playing, but Norm is coaching St George. And he was very pleased with his first game. He said he said he was pleased with his powerful running and his work in the scrum. So that's pretty high praise coming from someone like Norm Provan. Now he scores his first try in round 3, 1968, round 3 against Newtown. But he only plays 6 matches in 1968 because he badly breaks his leg. So he misses most of the season. He doesn't start playing again until 1969, and the 1969 season. Well, that's a big year for Apisai because he becomes virtually a regular first grader. He plays 19 matches in 1969, but in 1969, it's also another big year, Colin, because his brother Inossi joins St George. So, how did this come about? How did Inossi end up at St George?
So what I was told by Inossi was they approached Apisai and asked, do you know of any other Fijians that would come across and play for us? And Inossi told me he was back in Nadi at the time.
Yep.
Just playing rugby union for his local village. And for Nadi itself, the province in there, over there. And Apisai said, "Look, my younger brother is playing over in Nadi. I think he would. I think he'd go okay in the game." So the call was put out to Inossi, and hence Inossi, the Saints brought him over and signed him.
Okay.
From a rugby union background too, so Inossi had never played league or anything, and he took to it pretty quick.
Yeah, so they've got they've got a house together. They get a house. They're living in a house down in South Hurstville, and both of them are working at St George Leagues Club. They both get jobs at St George Leagues Club.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's correct.
And then 1969 is also sort of like, well, a big year for the Tonga family, because I think it's the older brother Sella.
That's correct. Yep.
Sella is playing rugby union for Fiji, and the Fijian rugby union team is touring Australia in 1969. So did all the brothers sort of catch up together whilst that tour was taking place?
Yes, definitely. They always they were still pretty tight, even though they were countries, they were apart. But I know that they did always catch up when one of them, even another younger brother, would come over at different times of the year to support his two brothers at St George. So they were still tight knit. The brothers.
And the Tonga brothers, how did they find it living in Australia? Were they accepted, Colin? All the reports I read say that Apisai was sort of like a huge crowd favourite at St George, but in general, were they accepted here, by the general community?
They were, yeah.
Yeah.
This is I've heard of North here that they loved it, particularly in that area, the St George area, where they lived in that, and they were really big crowd favourites amongst the St George supporters, and in the local area, to which Nossi still lives to this day, still stays in that area. They really they were accepted well when they arrived.
It's apparently they were sort of like the life of the party. They would turn up to social events. They'd bring their guitars and they'd start.
That's correct, definitely. I've heard some stories that they'd bring the guitars and they'd be sing-alongs and everything. So they got on well with everyone, and in particular the players there at the club. I've spoken to a few of the players that played with them, and that's what they said. They said, genuinely good guys. That was the common word. They were gentlemen.
All right. So Colin Apisai continues playing with St George, and there's no doubt that through this period, 70, 71, 72, Apisai is a major part of the St George team, mate. If you read the match reports from the time, the journalists are always sort of saying things like Apisai's hard running would give St George the advantage. He was always continually backing up. Tonga was always a threat, so he's obviously a major part of the team during this period. Inossi is mainly playing in the reserves, I think, but he occasionally has the occasional first grade game, or first grade, it comes on as a replacement. But at the end of the 1972 season, as agreed with Frank Facer, he goes back home. He goes back to Fiji. He plays his final game for St George. In fact, coincidentally, the final game for St George is against Eastern Suburbs. His first match for St George was against East, and his final match was the 1972 preliminary final against Eastern Suburbs. St George lose that preliminary final. They get beaten by 8 points to 6. So he returns to Fiji. And Colin, again, there are different stories now about what happened when he got back to Fiji. We know he suffered some sort of injury, but what actually happened, Colin, when he got back to Fiji?
What I was told was that when he went back, he continued, like he was working with the family and that on the farm.
Yep.
Because he always took that time at the end of the year to go back, and he'd purchase like tractors and stuff like that to help the family out on the farm. So he was always on the farm and helping, doing duties on there. But at the same time, because he'd come from Sydney and he was really training. He was doing a lot of training on himself by himself.
Yes.
So he was road running like you wouldn't believe. Like, he was, road running, and he would go road running, and that's what I've heard is where he got a bit of a cut off barbed wire or something. Whether it was on road running or whether it was working on a farm.
Yeah.
So that's where I've been told that he got the injury from. Was from barbed wire.
And did he go to hospital over there? Do you know? Did he go to the hospital?
I don't know if he did or what, or whether he just thought it was a small minor cut and it would heal over just like a graze or something like that. But yeah, I don't know if he did have it seen to whilst he was there.
He probably thought because, well, obviously being a rugby league player, he would have suffered many cuts and bruises, and he probably just thought, oh, that's a little cut, that's nothing.
Yeah, that's probably it. So I don't know if he did get it attended to or what if anything. Yeah.
Well, he comes back to Australia, and he's only here for 4 days. They're training, St George are training down at Cars Park. It's a swimming and training facility there run by Dick Kane. And, he suddenly collapses, and, well, I know this must be very difficult, but, everything I've read about your uncle, Colin, he sort of seems like a larger-than-life character. He's a guy that's full of life, and now he's gone.
Yeah, they just come back after Christmas and resume training, as these clubs do, and he collapsed down at Cars Park, and now they called an ambulance and everything, and when they rushed him up the road, up the Princess Highway to St George Hospital, it was too late. He passed on the way up there, yeah.
I imagine, I imagine would have the Sydney Morning Herald reporting on the passing of Apisai said, quote, Tonga was a powerhouse on the field, but was a quiet gentleman off the field. They interviewed the great Arthur Beetson there, who said about Apisai, he said he was a great bloke, hard on the field, but without a bit of spite. So it must have been very devastating for the family. I know Apisai's mother, in particular, was extremely upset by all the events.
Yes, it was. So when he passed, the Dragons, they took a lot of the players. Well, they asked most of the players if they wanted to accompany the body, and they took him back to Taranaka. My father had to accompany them. They asked my father to go along with them, so part of the party. And they chartered a Qantas flight from Ding and went across and took him back to the village and gave him to his funeral, laid him to rest there back in Taranaka.
Apisai's legacy lives on in the village itself. There is where he was born. There is the Apisai Tonga Oval. Of course, the legacy, I suppose you could say, there is a litany of superstars who have followed Apisai. Everyone from Noah Nandruka through to Petro Sivanasiva. And also his brother Inossi. Now, Inossi continued playing with St George, didn't he?
That's correct. Inossi continued up until, I think, 1974 was his final year there, to which he finished the season there, and the following season he'd signed and went to play in the Brisbane competition for Wynnum Manly. Right. I think he was there for 2 seasons.
Right.
75 and 76. I know the first one in 75 when he arrived, he was in their first grade team and they won the competition.
Okay.
So they took it out, and it was they still actually talk about that team. It was quite a strong team, and Nadi was also named in the Win and Manly Team of the Century just a few years ago when they went through it, which was dominated by guys from that team.
Okay, and I understand Nadi also has given a lot of help to sort of the Fijian players that have followed. Like he's sort of advised a lot of the Fiji.
Yes. And Nadi sort of stayed. It was like the late 80s, early 90s when leagues sort of started to resurface.
Yes.
Fiji. And so it was starting to make a few inroads, and a few of their players in the rugby union team, the national team, were looking at jumping over to league. Now, when the Australian, I think it was New South Wales Rugby League at the time, they were running the game here. When they had, I think it was 1991 or 1990 or something like that, one of those pre-season sevens tournaments that they used to have. And they brought in some international countries like Samoa and some other ones, South Africa. And Fiji were a part of it. And they approached the Nadi to take on the coaching role, which he did, So he assembled some players from over there that were playing over there at the time, that were union players and who were willing to have a go and jump ship to the league ranks. In particular was Noah Ndruku.
Okay, yes, all right.
Yes, so he was in the national sevens team, and they'd won Hong Kong sevens against New Zealand, and he was a standout in that tournament. So he's jumped. He took the gamble and he jumped, and he's come over and played that pre-season sevens team, sevens tournament here in the Rugby League competition, and was noticed by Tim Sheens.
Yep. Okay.
And after that tournament, he was signed by the Raiders, who took him on board.
All right, so Colin, next year, hopefully, if we pass this COVID-19 epidemic, a Fijian team will compete in the Ron Massey Cup, which is one of the lower divisions of the New South Wales Rugby League. It's a huge step forward for Rugby League in Fiji. But Colin, I just wanted to know, if you had the chance to say something to your uncle now, if you could say something to Apisai, what would you say?
Oh, look, I would probably say, I'd probably ask him. It'd be more of the inquiring about, how did you find playing with those big names?
Yes.
When you came to Australia, those guys. That team that he actually forced his way into, some of those names, big names of the sport. I would ask him how was it like playing with those guys, and learning off those guys, because I imagine like the standard of rugby league in the north of England would have been way different to what it was here, and how he had to adapt. I know, I know he told me it was a big thing. It was a big thing for both of them, adapting to gaining that professional attitude of training every day. From coming from rugby union and where they only train probably 2 days a week or whatever, but to actually for St George where they were training each day, and they were doing extras, because these guys like the Rapers and the Langhams and that were getting in their ear saying, you have to do this if you want to play in this in this competition. You've always got to be one step ahead, so you're always got to be working all the time off the field, particularly training, doing extras, things like that. So they really adapted well to that side of things in the professional game.
That's the way it was. The first Fijian, Apisai Toga. My name's Rob Corra. On behalf of Colin Sakuru, this program was produced by Tony Peterson. Until next time, may the Force be with you.
I don't know about you, but it's in tomorrow, that's for sure. What a start.